Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth. This is the Common Sense Christian channel, and today we want to look at the question, do we no longer have a rule of law in America? Well, it's an important question for us to answer because the rule of law has been that which has really defined America. And if we give up on our rule of law, or if the law is not equally applied, or if the law is not the same for those who are in the lowest position as compared to those who are in the highest position, then really we no longer have a rule of law. And if we no longer have a rule of law, the question that we need to ask is then, do we even have a basis for a nation? Because if the law is not equally applied, then tyrants can get into power. And tyrants can rule over people, and tyrants can silence those who are opposed to what they're for. And so we need to look at this very carefully because the trust between the government and the people that they serve is vital. And once that trust is lost, especially if that trust is lost because it's been abused to the point where the government is no longer worthy of that trust, then, well, we're in trouble, aren't we, as a nation? And so the question, do we have a rule of law in America anymore or not, is one that we really need to look at. And in order to look at that, I thought it would be helpful to go back over recent history and see how maybe we got to the point where we're at today. And it started, I believe, or at least it started in part with 9/11. With September 11th of 2001 and the terrorist attacks on the Trade Center. When that occurred, America certainly united for a common cause, didn't we? And the government sought special privileges to start surveilling all of the citizens with the intent to try and find out others who may have nefarious plots against America. And most of us were for that. We weren't doing anything wrong anyway, so go ahead and surveil us. Maybe they would catch those who are doing something wrong. But you have to admit that that has gone too far and it's gone too long. So much so that they keep records on just about everything that you do today. From the purchases that you make to the places that you travel, to the opinions that you may hold and post on social media. To your phone records, and just on and on and on. And I believe you can see that can pose a problem after a while, can't it? We just saw the prosecution, if not the persecution, of a former president. He was convicted of 34 crimes, felonious crimes, they said, just in this last week. They were crimes that to my knowledge, nobody else has ever been prosecuted for. But he was prosecuted for them because he was a threat to those who are in power. And whether you are fine with that, whether you didn't want him to come back into power and you're for the ones who are currently in power or not, really doesn't make a difference, because what one side can do today, the other side can do tomorrow. And do we really want to get to the point where the rule of law that we have is something that's ever changing? And that's weaponized to the point where it can be used against those who are political enemies, or for those who might threaten certain political goals that some people have. And so, anyway, I believe a big part of our problem today began over 20 years ago when the government started surveilling every citizen in the United States of America to the point where we've lost our privacy. The second thing that occurred was a few years later in 2007, 2008, with what's become known as the financial crisis or the Great Depression. And if you were in certain parts of the country at that time, then you know that real estate collapsed. You know that a lot of people lost their jobs. You know that the stock market collapsed. If you've done any research into this particular time, you also know that we came very close to having a bank meltdown. And because of that, the Federal Reserve and the government combined with an idea that we could just borrow money in an unlimited fashion. And so we put aside former fiscal restraints that were part of our law at that time. And the laws were either overturned or they were just flat out ignored. And as a result, there were people who got great power by being able to issue debt. Now, the Federal Reserve has been able to issue debt since it came into being, but not in any way that approached what happened after the year 2007, 2008. I'm old enough to remember the savings and loan crisis that occurred back during the mid-1980s. I was a real estate appraiser at that time, and at that time, people deposited their money into banks, and then the banks and the savings and loans would loan out that money to other people for mortgages or for car loans or for other types of loans that they needed. They would take in the deposits and they would pay a certain interest rate, and they would make loans at a higher interest rate, and they would make their profit on the difference. But that's not the way loans are made anymore. The Federal Reserve, our central bank, has the right to create money out of nothing, and that's exactly what they do. So they've created trillions of dollars in recent years since the financial crisis. And what they're doing is they're just creating money and putting digits in people's bank accounts, which they can spend, but in return for the central banks essentially acting as a bookkeeping facility and acting as someone who will create this out of thin air, they get to collect interest on it, so that when the loans are paid back, they get interest on money that was never theirs in the first place, that didn't exist in the first place. They just created it out of thin air, put it onto a computer, and then those computers then transferred it between different banks to where we can spend it just like we used to the cash that you carried in your wallet. But at this point, in 2007 and 2008, we really lost control of our financial responsibility. And then in recent years, we've just had one thing after another, haven't we? In 2020, we had a terrible disease that spread through the world, and America was shut down. Something that we never thought would happen. Even as we were watching it happen in China, we said, well, at least it won't happen here. And it did happen here. And we were told it's just going to be for a few weeks. And then we found out that a few weeks turned into a few months. We found out that people that ran businesses could no longer conduct business unless they were on a government's favorable list. And who was on the government's favorable list? Well, it was those who were considered to be indispensable, like Walmart and Costco and all the liquor stores, and just on and on and on. Whoever the government said, yes, you can conduct business. But most of the mom and pop businesses were shut down. Many of them went out of business for all time. And at that point, we were also restricted on our movement. You can go here, but you got to wear a mask. You can't go here, and if you get caught here, we'll arrest you, and then we'll fine you for doing so. And then they came up with a cure for this disease that turned out to be as bad as the disease itself. And many people were forced to take that cure in order to keep their government jobs, whether federal or state. And so in 2020, we lost a freedom of movement and decisions as to how we would treat our own bodies. And then 2021, we lost the right to protest. After an election that many considered to be a little bit shaky, a little bit unfair, and when people peacefully assembled in the state capitol, and while there were a few people who were not peaceful, the vast majority, probably 99% of them or more, were peaceful. And as we found out from videotapes, surveillance tapes of the Capitol, many of these people were invited in. The doors were opened by officials at the Capitol. And they even showed them through the Capitol building. And then the FBI went after these people, arrested many of them. Some were held without charges and without bail indefinitely. Most of them pled guilty because they were scared into the idea that they'd go away for sedition for the rest of their life. And so many of these people are still in jail. People who just were concerned that the election hadn't been conducted fairly. And so in 2021, we lost our freedom to assemble and our right to protest. Well, we've had other things that have occurred since then, haven't we? We've watched the Justice Department become weaponized to the point where it protects those who are in power, but it goes after those who are not in power or who threaten their power. And it's being done very openly and very prominently, so as to send a chilling warning to everybody. You get out of hand and now this could happen to you as well. And then we've been aiding and abetting our federal government illegal immigration. And it's to the point now where it's very concerning. I was watching an interview that Russell Brand was doing just today. He was interviewing a woman by the name of Naomi Wolf. And she was talking about the fact that, by the way, she's an immigration expert. And she was talking about the fact that the UN, in conjunction with the U.S. State Department, has been holding staging areas outside the country to recruit and transport illegals into our nation. Some of them have literally been flown by the State Department into various airports around America. And by the way, the State Department does not deny this. This is not some conspiracy theory. This is something that they're doing. The scary thing is most of these people appear to be military age. They appear to be males. They even appear to have leaders at times. And they're being housed in places like Chicago and Boston in barracks. Why are they here? Why would our U.S. government assist them in coming here? Why would they provide them with housing? Why don't they give us information on this? And so we have this, where we no longer have a border in America because our own government is bringing in people whom have not been vetted properly, or in a more scary scenario, maybe they have been vetted by people who don't have our best interests in mind. But our borders have been open. The state I live in has been so inundated with illegal aliens in the past 4 or 5 years that even our real estate taxes have doubled during that time. Somebody has to pay for this. And those who are bringing them in have some kind of a twisted theory that if they can bring them in and if they can allow them to vote without checking their ID, that they'll vote for a certain party, and perhaps they will. The question is, what kind of leaders would get to the point where they would endanger their own citizens just so that they can keep power? And the answer is a pretty wicked leadership. Realize this is called Common Sense Christian. I called it that not because I have so much common sense, but because I think Christianity is the most common sense way to live. God's laws are the best. And when we see people who are lying and cheating and stealing and committing crimes, we have to ask ourselves a question: why are they doing that? Decent people would not do that. Again, I go back to this statement by President Eisenhower: a people that values its privileges more than it does its principles soon will have neither. Well, people like the goodies, the handouts, the things they get from the government. They like their privileges. And many people have abandoned their principles, their integrity, and their morals in a vain attempt to keep their privileges. But I believe they're going to find out that soon they're going to lose their privileges, just as they've so willingly given up their principles. And then we have this. We have a government that seems to be pressing for war in inexplicable ways. We have funded Ukraine. We essentially, apparently, helped establish a leadership in Ukraine. But when we did that, we promised Russia that we would never allow them to be part of NATO, never part of that treaty, because if they were part of that treaty, then the Western countries could move weapons in there in order to protect them. But Ukraine is on Russia's border. Imagine if Russia and China had an alliance with Mexico, a treaty that allowed them to put weapons aimed at America across the Rio Grande. How well do you think we would respond to that? Well, Russia hasn't responded well, have they? And yet we seem to be intent upon provoking a war. Why? What possible benefit could we have with getting in a war with Russia? And again, you'd have to ask those who are in positions of power. And by the way, the media has certainly been supporting this, haven't they? Everything from CNN to Fox News have been supporting this war, trying to convince us that we need to get into it. France right now is starting to have a compulsory draft, or talking about a compulsory draft so that they can get involved with the war in Ukraine. England is starting to talk about the fact that they're going to have a compulsory draft so that they can get involved with the war in Ukraine. What's going to happen in America, do you suppose, when they decide that we have to get involved with that as well? And what kind of lunacy do you have to endanger some type of a nuclear conflict? Another thing President Eisenhower did after he stepped down from office after 8 years, and Kennedy was transitioning into the office of president, and Eisenhower at that point talked about this unholy alliance between military and industry. He called it the military-industrial complex, and he warned Americans that it was getting so powerful and they were having so much influence over politicians that they would soon be the ones that were calling the shots. Is that what we have now? And so again, we look at all these things. We look at all these different problems that are just flooding in from every corner. It's almost too much to be able to even process, isn't it? But again, a wise person is going to ask, what's going on? And why are we doing so many things outside of the law? And the only answer I believe we can come to is that we no longer have a rule of law, at least not one that has equal application, that's equally applied for this group and for that group. And so whether we're talking about our freedoms for privacy and movement, and what we're going to put into our body or not, or whether we're talking about our freedom to assemble and to protest peacefully, or whether we're talking about our finances and what's going on, what monies are being pledged by our government for us to repay to a central bank that's just getting this money from nowhere, but it's getting interest on the repayment. All these things are happening, some inside the law, just barely, some very clearly outside the law. But what's a Christian to do? What happens when you no longer have a rule of war or a rule of law? And I think the answer is at some point there will be a war. And I'm not suggesting that we start one, not by any length of the imagination. I think that anybody that even contemplates civil war right now and thinks that would be a good thing just isn't looking very far ahead. They're not looking at the consequences for such a thing, at the damage such a thing could bring, or a secession by different states to leave the United States of America. Well, that's superior to war. Can it be done without war? There's a lot of things that are going on right now, and I believe that the only solution that we have is God. I believe God's the only one that can stop the madness that we have plunged into. But I don't know if He's going to or not. I think we have too much sin in our lives. Just look at the great number of Christians who are indulging in sin right now, or who are supporting those who are indulging in sin. I'm not talking about the idea that somehow we have to, whenever we vote for somebody, that they have to be a pristine and perfect Christian. But I am saying they need to at least have morals. And if they've had sin in their life, they need to have turned away from that sin. They don't need to be continuing it. So many of the people that we support today want to continue things like abortion. They want to promote things like sexual immorality. They want to protect those who've been harming children, molesting children. And yet we'll give them our support if they'll give us our goodies. And it's getting to the point now where we have devolved into a nation, a second-rate nation, by comparison to what it was just a few short years ago, that no longer seems to be bound by a moral code that's a godly code, but seems only to be bound by the calculations of what they can get if they act in a certain way. By the way, there's been times throughout history where these very types of things have happened. The nation of Israel had a covenant with God. It was a covenant that they would obey God, and because they would obey God and follow Him, He would protect them and He would bless them. In Deuteronomy chapter 29, Moses talks to the people just before he dies, and he says, "You are standing here in order to enter a covenant with the Lord your God, a covenant the Lord is making with you this day and sealing with an oath to confirm you this day as His people, that He may be your God as He promised you and as He swore to your fathers. I'm making this covenant with its oath not only with you who are standing here, but also with those who are not here today." And then he said this, "Make sure that no man or woman among you today whose heart turns away from the Lord our God to go and worship gods of those nations, make sure there's no root among you that produces such a bitter poison." Moses is talking about the fact that God has given them laws that they have to obey. But it's a covenant, it's agreement, it's an agreement. If they'll do this, God will bless them and God will protect them. And so they willingly entered into that covenant. They said, yes, we will obey God. But then in a few short years, they stopped obeying God. And in Jeremiah, this is what God had the prophet Jeremiah say to the people who had broken His covenant. "I gave them this command, obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in all the ways I command you, that it may go well with you." But they did not listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclination of their hearts. "Therefore, say to them, this is a nation that's not obeyed the Lord its God or responded to correction. Truth has perished from their lips." And so now Israel is abandoning the covenant. They're abandoning the rule of law. Well, what happens as a result of that? God gives an example in Hosea. In Hosea chapter 1, Hosea was told by God the following, "Go take yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord." He was essentially to go and marry a prostitute to show Israel what they were doing to God. They had been in a covenant with God. They'd been pledged to God, but they'd been committing prostitution with the idols of the nation around them. And so God gave them a stark example, a prophet who would marry an adulterous woman. And they had children, 3 children, but the third child is the one I want to talk about in verse 8. Talking about his wife, after she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. The Lord said, "Call him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." Lo-Ammi means not my people. What had happened? When the people abandoned the rule of law, they abandoned the covenant with God, they no longer had a right to be a nation. There was no longer a basis for there being a nation under God because they were no longer under God and His commands. They had taken themselves out of it. And God would destroy them because of that. There would be a very small remnant brought back to reestablish the nation of Israel, but most of the people perished. And the reason that they did was because they broke the covenant. They broke the law. And when they no longer had a rule of law, they no longer had a basis to be a nation under God. And so now do you see the comparison? It's not the people who have broken the covenant with the authority, the rightful authority being God, in the example we just looked at. But in this instance, it is those who are supposed to be the rightful authority, those who had been entrusted with authority, that broke the covenant. And now we don't have a rule of law in America anymore, not one you can count on. And when that happens, a nation no longer has a basis for being a nation. So, what's the solution to this cheerful message today? And the answer is what it's always been. If you have taken part in this, either because you've been so hateful to one side or the other, either because you have turned a blind eye to the breaking of the law when it was done by your side and then moaned and complained when it was done by the other, you need to repent. You haven't been acting as a child of God. You haven't had integrity. You haven't been honest with yourself or with others, and you need to repent for that. And once you've repented, then you're going to have the right to pray to God. You have to be in a covenant relationship with Him, and there's a very specific plan of salvation that God has set forth within the gospel. But once you're in that covenant position, you have a right now to be entreating God for His help. And I believe we need to be doing that. It's true that it may be too late. It was too late for Israel. There were some who repented, and while they were spared spiritually and eternally, they still had to pay a physical price. We may have to do that. And there's something else that I think is very important. When somebody is threatening you with war, you better get prepared for war. I'm not talking about preparing yourself to be warlike and be violent towards others and start a war with somebody. I'm just saying that when somebody threatens you, you better get ready for a fight. When I was a kid and a bully threatened to beat you up, he was usually intent on at least trying. And even though you had no desire for a fight, if you didn't take a stand, you're going to take a beating. At some point, we're going to have to take a stand. It needs to be a righteous stand. It needs to be a loving stand. And it needs to be predicated. It needs to be first done with repentance and done with the reestablishment of our covenant with ourselves and with God. And then we can go about trying to reestablish the rule of law in America. If it's not too late, there is one who can reestablish that, and that's God. But we're going to have to be righteous enough to do our part. But barring that, should you find your privileges just too enticing to be bothered with principles, then be assured of President Eisenhower's prediction. Those who would abandon their principles in order to get privilege are going to soon lose both. It's not too late for us, but we need to start doing the right thing now. And I believe it starts with reestablishing a rule of law between ourselves and God. He's told us what He wants us to do. Let's repent and reestablish that covenant with Him, and then we can seek reestablishing the rule of law within our land. And maybe by God's grace we'll be able to do just that. Hope is not lost as long as we draw breath, but we need to do something. And we need to take a righteous and loving stand. The question is, do enough Americans have the courage to do that anymore?